Hi, we are live, just sharing the link. I think the Prime Minister can start.
Great. Give me a second.
Are we starting?
Yeah, one second. Just checking my notes up. Really sorry for the delay.
Guys, just let me know when to start. Like I'm ready. Let me know whenever you want me to start.
Yep. Debating on the motion, this House prefers a world without the desire for revenge. Prime Minister, the floor is all yours.
Okay, I also want to turn my camera on, but I don't know if it's gonna lag. Can you please let me know that you can see me and hear me properly?
We can hear you, Tarushi.
Both work.
Okay. Wait. Let me put up a timer. 3, 2, 1, go. We think there are benefits to a world without revenge, and not everything magically becomes okay, but it's still a better world to exist in. 3 arguments: first on peace, second on CJS, and then lastly on like minority struggles and why we think we're better that way. At the offset, I want everyone to know that this is a prefers motion, which means that it's a new world from inception, which means that you can't say that behavior and motives that apply in status quo apply in our world as well, unless you prove that to me. Couple of lines on characterization. First, I'm going to talk about revenge, then I'm going to talk about what that looks like in our world. On revenge, we think revenge looks like the idea that someone's done something bad to you and you also have the right to do something bad to them as well, which means that someone hurts you, therefore you hurt them. Basically, the idea of like an eye for an eye, right? We think examples of this exist. Like, I think there is like countless examples. It can be you not liking someone in a professional workspace because they took an important project from you, you not liking someone that you dated in the past because you feel like they did you wrong, you not liking someone in your family because you had struggle over something like poverty. I think like you have the idea of revenge for like not people that didn't stay in relationships with you or people that left. Trigger warning: for instance, you actively harm or secretly women that don't say yes to you because you felt wrong because of the way they behaved, right? I think the manifestations of revenge are most likely going to be negative, with little space for doing better or changing behavior, because revenge justifies hurt, and that's a slippery slope that you don't want. Second, I think revenge looks like the amount of damage that you're causing to someone isn't necessarily going to be proportional. I think it will be disproportionate as well. Someone needs to make else. I think the idea that this is disproportionate is extremely wrong. So you can kill someone because they killed you, but you can also like go ahead and kill their entire family. And revenge, the concept of revenge justifies that. One more clarification: I think other emotions associated with revenge, such as anger, continue to exist. That's probably true. It's just that the desire, like, it doesn't manifest into revenge itself. What does our world look like? People do not possess the desire for revenge, and therefore revenge no longer exists. It has no space in people's minds or their acts. I want to make 3 arguments. My first argument is in terms of why I think this is a better world. First, I want to talk about peace within people. I think the idea of peace is like directly on the opposite side of the idea of revenge, right? Because revenge involves a lot of violence and hurting people. I think peace is a state where individuals are happy with their lives and they're not being hurtful towards other beings. And this is something good. This is something that we want, because you let people live without the fear that, oh, someone's like, they might have messed up or they might have actively done something wrong. But you allow individuals to live without the fear of knowing that, oh, someone's probably going to get back at them some point in their lives, right? But know that you also stay away from vicious cycles of hurt. Like, it's just the cycle of hurt from one person to the other, because the point at which someone did something bad to you, you have an idea of revenge, you're probably going to like go ahead and continue that, right? But B, I think it's better because relationships are better. Why do I think that? I think you're more likely to let bad relationships go, because even if you felt hurt and your lover behaved in ways that you didn't like, you're more likely to just let that go, because the desire for revenge is what tells you to like hold on to ideas and relationships and constantly like torment that person, right? Trigger warning: things like revenge porn won't exist in the new world that we want, and we think that this is like a unique benefit that exists. I think, see, in terms of like majority rights activism, right? The idea of men's rights activism, I think these often exist as like a revenge response to the progressiveness that's spreading in the world currently, right? People are becoming more woke. I think the idea of washing down on minorities for the affirmative action that they get from the state is something that exists only in status quo. In our new world, this won't exist, which means that in status quo, if you give reservation to individuals from lower class or caste, the majority doesn't really like the majority like will bring themselves into it and make it about them and make it about, oh, I didn't get so and so benefit and why will other people get it, and they're taking something from me, therefore it's right for me to like go ahead and hurt them, right? I think the impact of this is that majority's point of view towards minorities is more sympathetic than an existing status quo. Yes, the majority can still question affirmative policies in opposition best case, but I think that they're less likely to take this anger out on a lower caste person whom they see benefiting from these policies. Second, I want to talk about the criminal justice system. I think we make a world where rehabilitation is better. I think that's something that we want because it gives individuals second chances. Individuals deserve second chances because like they have some idea of inherent humanness. I think the amount of problems that exist with crime and the criminal justice system right now are directly tied to the idea of revenge, right? Things like the mafia getting back at people that offended them, things like honor killings by parents that felt that their child did them wrong and you need to go ahead and kill that child. I think it looks like the general public and their perception towards this, because it's not just about whatever law you have or whatever narrative you want to have, it's about the way individuals perceive that as well, right? I think when it comes to the criminal justice system, the way majority of public looks at things in status quo is in terms of like revenge and celebrating the idea of hurt. In status quo, we've seen this multiple times. We've seen examples, especially in India, we've seen multiple examples of encounters by the police. We've seen multiple examples of the death penalty and people and individuals celebrating this. I think this is directly tied to the idea of revenge because a lot of states go ahead and do it simply because if they have sanction from the people, individuals feel that this is legit. The only difference is that the state is going ahead and doing it, right? I would say that it's a form of state sanctioned revenge. Why is that bad? I want to talk about a retributive justice system that ignores context and situations, which is bad, right? We think that you in their world, we think that you're normalizing the idea of use of violence by the state. Why is use of violence by the state bad? I think it's like inherently bad. You can't kill people, you have a social contract, but it's a slippery slope. I'm going to explain that after the PY from closing. Please go ahead.
You correctly identify that other emotions like hate and anger would still exist. Could you draw that clean, clear line where revenge is distinguished by hatred? Because we will argue that everything you say would...
Revenge and anger are two very different emotions. You can be mad about someone doing something to you, but you can still go ahead and not actively take revenge from them and do things to hurt them, right? They're very different things. This is why I clarify in opening, like within first seconds, I say the desire for revenge does not exist. Therefore, revenge does not exist. Any idea of them saying, oh, like revenge still exists, is them squirreling. That's not a fair debate. Let's talk about why states sanctioning violence is bad. It's a slippery slope because once you get used to the idea of like state sanctioned violence, you go ahead and like further normalize this, right? We think that this looks like the government washing down on minority struggles in various parts of the world. I think this was especially true for the Indian state during things like CAA, NRC, Black Lives Matter, things like the Stonewall riots. What is the comparative? In our world, the public isn't fueled by revenge anymore. We think the most likely outcome is that individuals are fairer in the way that they look at things and that second chances can exist. Third, on minority struggles, I think in status quo, violence is used as a means to an end. In our world, we think that that's less likely going to be an option. The idea is simple. We want to protect minorities from violence. I think violence and revenge are very closely tied to each other. I think the most likely outcome is going to be that in our world, minorities find other ways to emancipate themselves, right? The idea of like still furthering their interest and like just not thinking that, oh, this is something that revenge, rather this is something act that exists. I think anger as an emotion continues to exist that uniquely fuels protests that allow you to still get the goal that you want, even if they want to argue that violence is fine, right? But I think that even if violence exists, I think the degree of violence is lesser and it's most likely going to be for self-defense. At the very least, you're not doing it to hurt people. Very proud.
Thanking the PM for that fine speech. Leader of thought, whenever you're ready.
All right, am I audible?
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. I would like to take POIs by chat. I'll try to take them from closing government if they have one at about 5-minute mark. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Three contributions coming from opening opposition. Firstly, two pieces of setup. While you're able to change the power structure existing within the society or have some level of social change. Thirdly, why the coping mechanism that they have to promote is exclusionary to the poor and the minority, and why you're the only one that gives catharsis to those people who are not able to access that. Firstly, two pieces of setup. So the first piece of setup is that they never really answer the POI that closing opposition mentions, which is what is the counterfactual, the point to which you feel anger, because the cause of injustice or the cause of revenge is likely to be happening anyway. You're likely to be suffering injustice on both sides of the house. Our mechanism is that you resort to desire for revenge, but on their side, what they have to defend is how to cope with that injustice. They're more likely to for instance, things like gobble your emotion up, and likely to be really, really depressed. Those are likely to be emotions that they have to be dealing with under their side of the house. The second piece of setup is that there is I want to obviously preempt a lot of the impacts the government side made, which is that obviously just because you have desire for revenge does not mean that you're just going to like kill all of those people that have committed like just injustice upon you. Obviously, you're likely to be pursuing revenge based on the legal and moral boundary. The reason being that obviously there's likely to be first punishment, the point to which you go beyond this boundary, things like actually prison, whatnot, or for instance, the social stigma that you're currently making. This ultimately means that you're less likely to be perceiving revenge in a manner to which it goes beyond this. Then moving on to my first substantive on why this actually changes a power structure as well as create some level of social change. I think the first mechanism here is that people are more likely to be stepping up. This is because of first, I think you're having voicing out these types of concerns requires huge courage. This is because first, there's likely to be backlash against the established or backlash against the people that you're pointing that have problems with. Things like religious organization. If it's the police brutality problem, it's the police organization that you're going against. Second, oftentimes one person does not really change anything, right? Obviously, in order to create social change, you need critical mass to do it. And obviously, you don't exactly know how much time it will make to actually have that critical mass to actually create social change. But thirdly, I think oftentimes there's a collective action problem. That is to say, even if you do not voice out, if other person voices the same problem as you, you're likely to be bandwagoning without spending a lot of time. What all of this implies is that if you're in a rational mindset, obviously voicing out is something that you probably shouldn't be doing simply because it is it is obviously less productive thing that you should be doing. But on our side, it is more likely that you should be doing this simply because first, obviously revenge ultimately means you have suffered immense amount of injustice. You have immense amount of hatred toward perpetrator, which is why that feeling of emotion trumps all of these short-run costs that we have mentioned about why people are not likely to be opting into voicing out your concerns. But second, oftentimes the failure of the movement, even if this is obviously it takes a lot of time for the social movement to succeed, but the memory of the injustice and the desire for revenge continuously clings and remains in your memory. It remains in that vibrant vision of that you currently have, which is the reason as to why you're more likely to be sustaining that kind of anger, the point to which you want to currently go for social change. But thirdly, I think you also solve the collective action problem, because if you have a desire for revenge, this ultimately means you want to do the revenge on your own hands, which means you don't want, for instance, like another person voicing out some concern and you want bandwagon out of it, but you actually want you to actually solve this problem with your own hands to bring revenge by attacking the perpetrator and making the perpetrator pay. I think this ultimately means that people are more likely to be stepping out. Second piece of mechanism: why would people more likely be listening to your concerns and more likely to be caring? Four reasons why. First is because obviously, if you're, for instance, doing revenge, whatnot, obviously there's likely to be a sense of danger to perpetrators simply because you never really know what kind of punishment these people will do. The point to which you don't listen to them, which means you have inherent incentive to listen to what they demand for. Second is that oftentimes revenge and therefore what the demands for revenge, and they were catering that to politicians oftentimes is something that is beneficial to politicians, simply because if revenge is the first priority of that voter, this means that the point to which politicians cater to them, that is a clear voter base that you're able to get, which means politicians have more of an incentive to listen out to them and care for them. But thirdly, I would say that if you're angry and you want a desire for revenge to just punish the perpetrator, you're just going to do whatever you can. I would say, i.e., things like, for instance, voicing out in your SNS about the problems, for instance, talking to your friends or going to news channels and doing interviews of how, for instance, the corrupt government has fucked up your life. What all of this means is that even if people do not want to see it, they are forced to see it, the point to which all of the social discourse around it is talking about that abuse. But lastly, if people do not listen if the public do not listen, there's likely to be immense amount of public cost. That is to say, there's likely to be cost, the point to which people are more likely to be coming up to rallies, chanting every day about the injustices. There's more likely to be, for instance, degrading of your national image, the point to which these people speak up in the international news and journals, talking about the abuse that has happened within your country, whatnot. This means that there is immense amount of cost simply because these people want to revenge by themselves, and that is the point to which people have more of an incentive to care. The impact of this is three things. First is that you raise awareness, and oftentimes people are more likely to be listening to you, which means oftentimes you're able to create social change, things like having better policies cater to you, whatnot. But second, I think oftentimes the fear of getting that revenge in a world like this, because this is the Tissal's prefers motion, this ultimately means that you're more likely to have chilling effect, to the point to which future perpetrators also fear about the revenge, and that's the point to which you're less likely to be committing these actions in the first place. We give you that we give you that preventive mechanism. But thirdly, I think people are also more likely to be getting more solace on our side, because the point to which a lot of the people step out, this means that you have the people who are in the same condition as you. You're able to pull your interests together. You're more likely to have a safe space to which you're able to voice out concerns. Same people with same problems, more likely to be empathizing with you, whatnot. This is inherently beneficial on our side. Second, I want to talk about why this coping mechanism is exclusionary to poor and minority under their side. Simply because, first, oftentimes being truly patient is only for the privileged people. First, because injustice under privileged people are oftentimes irreversible. Things like financial fraud or being cheated by a girlfriend, boyfriend is something that is reversible, compared to the irreversible harm that these poor people get. Things like, for instance, that cripples your future. Things like police brutality killing your family, or for instance, being sexually abused, like that obviously changes your entire life, entire way in which you see your life, whatnot. But second thing is that oftentimes the rich have a lot of support structure, things like getting like therapy, or like oftentimes having family or friends that you're able to talk to, or oftentimes it's just simply that you have a lot of money, which means you have a lot of stress coping mechanisms you're able to resort to compared to the poor. What this ultimately means is that anger and the desire for revenge is the most accessible way in which you're able to cope with that injustice. Cope with the injustice compared to a lot of the other mechanisms which can only be applied to people who are rich. Therefore, I would say if injustice occurs on both sides of the health, it is better that we decrease the accessibility to which people are able to find solace, people are able to find catharsis by, which is the most accessible way in which you're able to express this. Very proud to oppose.
Thanking the leader of HOP for that fine speech. DPM, whenever you're ready.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Loud and clear.
Thank you. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Tarushi's clarification makes the entire opposition case redundant. Tarushi clearly clarifies that the idea of like revenge is separate from the idea of anger. The idea of revenge solely means that you have to like defend your, you have to like harm other people. You have to actively go and hurt their interests. On our side of the house, this what if like anger can manifest in is like looking like protecting your own interests and manifest and like prioritizing your own interests about the need to like harm others. This is exactly what the characterization of revenge that Tarushi gives you, which makes the case redundant. Right? This means that the desire for revenge not existing does not mean that people like cobble up emotions. People are still free to express emotions like anger, and emotions like disappointment, emotions like discontent with the government, etc. Right? This means that the idea of like politicians not being called out on our side of the house does not exist, because the people still have the unique ability to like vote out politicians, and the idea of like expressing their resentment against politicians by disagreeing with them, all that stuff still exists. On their idea of like critical mass, then critical mass still occurs on our side of the house through things like conversation, through things like discourse, through talk, like all this stuff. Like people are not driven by revenge when they talk in international forums. That is uniquely an idea and an expression of their own concerns, and a means of prioritizing their own interests. That is not revenge. Revenge is when you actively go and harm other people and not care about protecting your own interests in that like run, right? Which means you actively deprioritize yourself in the process of revenge. This means that the idea of like critical mass that we achieve is basically on our side of the house. People still engage in conversation. People still voice their own concerns. People still have like the voice to like speak in international forums, right? All this still exists on our side of the house. Revenge is not the only exclusive way to cause social change. This is not something O has proved. We don't think CO can prove this either. Both of them are already out of this debate at this point. We think that rallying, etc., still exists because people can still demand for their own resources. Nextly, a few furthering our own arguments on that point. We think that we believe that Tarushi has given you all a macro impact of like creating more peaceful societies and creating a more equitable society where minorities are still viewed in a like positive way. We think that on the idea of like opposition's idea of like backlash, we think that is less likely to occur in our side of the house, because backlash essentially acts as a form of state sanctioned revenge, right? This looks like Trump telling people that Mexicans are taking away your jobs, and then people of his like voter base actively taking revenge on their on by like exerting harm on other people, regardless of whether they go to jail, right? This means that this is what we tell you. They're actively deprioritizing themselves and prioritizing the need to hurt others. This is what revenge looks like. That does not exist in our world. Majorities are significantly more sympathetic to minorities on our side of the house. Things such as like people feeling the resentment, people feeling anger still exists. This does not manifest in revenge. That is the only difference on our side of the house. The micro impact that we tell you occurs on our side of the house is that this cycle of retaliation that exists on their side does not occur. This means that the constant principle of like an eye for an eye creates this constant rule of conflict. It creates a constant state of anxiety that prolongs distress. People keep revisiting the trauma that they have. People keep becoming more anxious of like when the other person is going to retaliate. It does not end at one point, right? One retaliation prompts another. It keeps on manifesting into a cycle. This creates a circle of hurt maximization that we believe is principally bad, right? We believe that on their side of the house, people keep revisiting this trauma and lose sight that the ultimate goal must be like rehabilitating yourself, must be like the prioritization of your own interests and moving on from the like crimes that you suffered, etc. Right? We think that this then means like as a micro impact on our side of the house, societies are much more peaceful. Personal relationships are much more sorted out because people are able to engage with each other and like convey their interest in a more equitable manner. People are able to voice their concerns. That still exists on our side of the house. We think then on the idea of like better criminal justice reform. We think that like the idea of abandoning capital punishment is something that can develop easily on our side of the house. We create more value positive citizens through rehabilitation, because the idea of the need for the state to punish these citizens because they have wronged the society as a form of revenge does not exist. You do not have like this idea of like the prison system, which on the outside of the house has created in the status quo a harmful loop effect in like what you can see in like most of America, where you have like these, where you create like this further systems of trauma within prisons. And you keep on maximizing hurt on the outside of the house within through like this through this deterrent form of like punishment that they advocate for, right? This worsens problems, and these examples do not like avoid things like crimes of passion. We also think that victims of these crimes are better off on our side of the house because they focus on their well-being, they focus on their reconciliation. This looks like, say, for example, South Africa post-apartheid, where victims like engaged with the people who perpetrated crimes, and the main objective was to like sort out stuff between them by like, and not like prioritizing the need to harm them. This is what like punishment and like the criminal justice reform system would look like on our side of the house. We think on our side of the house, people are also less likely to like take law into their own hands. Things like police brutality are like less likely to occur because it is like necessitated because of this, because the police feels like police feels like feels the need to sort of react to the protest in a way that like acts as revenge essentially, right? We think that also is like the state may be a bad actor, but like it is still better than individual actors taking law into their own hands. The things like things like mobbing, etc., reduce on our side of the house. People are less likely to take matters into their own hands, take revenge, etc. What are the impacts then we give you, and how are they more expansive than anything that any other house can bring, right? We tell you that individuals are more fairer in terms of their personal engagements. That is the micro impact. We tell you that people view like the people from majority view others more sympathetically. This is better because it creates like the greater space for discourse. It creates more space for conversation and engagement with each other, which leads to a more peaceful society, which is the ultimate goal on our side. The metric that we must judge this debate on is where hurt maximization is lesser. We believe that it's lesser on our side of the house, very simply so because responses like revenge can be disproportionate. It need not be proportionate. And we also believe that revenge like leads to like active deprioritization of your own interests, which is principally wrong as well. We also think that criminal justice reform is better on our side of the house. You have a lesser scope for like normalization of state-sanctioned violence, state-sanctioned police brutality, etc. We think that the main prioritization of the like justice system becomes to like center rehabilitation, create more value positive citizens, and act as like a way of pushing virtue towards society instead of creating this harmful loop of perpetuating more violence to like to achieve some sort of abstract good which cannot be realized. Very proud to propose vote OG.
Thanking the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech. DLO, whenever you're ready.
Hello, am I audible?
Audible and visible.
All right. Yeah, I'll take POIs through chat. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to start this speech with just clarifying what I think that the most common form of revenge actually looks like, because I think Haesung already preempts the idea that laws and legislations exist to prevent worse forms of revenge. So even if you see yourself as victim, it is unclear as to why you will necessarily kill the perpetrator or disproportionately impose harm on them. Often people have an incentive to do revenge in a way that is aligned with the boundary of legality or morality. And given that this is what this house prefers motion, and therefore it is allowed for up to defend the status quo, I don't think in the status quo most people default to revenging in a method of killing that perpetrator and stuff like this. And therefore, this harm is not as prevalent, and I think that the more likely mechanism of revenge is usually engaging in things like some sort of ways to change social structure, things like protests, riots, or strikes. Maybe these are slightly more radical in comparison to things like peaceful talking, but I think that this is a trade-off that we're willing to bite in this debate, because the premise of this debate is that there already has been some level of injustice that has occurred. Then government needs to explain how you get change under their end, because as what OG correctly observed, states can be shit on both sides, privileged people can be shit on both sides to retain benefit and remain privileged. The question therefore is, how do we ignite minorities to be able to change their circumstances? Because on the government side, I'd say that social movement or efforts to correct the injustice would not exist, for the fact that when PM tells me that things like men's rights movement were ignited as a result of wanting to revenge is a concession that the flip side is also true, wherein under government bench, you might not have men's rights movement, but it is also equally true that you do not have women's rights movement under their side, as much as you do not have things like white people's lives matter under their end. It is also likely that things like BLM also equally does not exist under their end. DPM tries to squirrel by saying that people will speak out under their end, but how and why will people speak out? Because you don't want to harm the perpetrator, which is the premise of opening government, meaning that under their side, women might want to talk about the injustices that they experience, but they never wish or never try to demolish patriarchy. You don't want to topple down the dictatorial regime that killed your family. So I get that there will be some level of discussion under government, but there's no end point to their discussion. That is where this case just falls apart. Being patient or individually enduring the pain and suffering, which is the most likely counterfactual therefore, which opening government fails to defend, has 3 key problems that I think is unmitigable. Firstly, there's a limit to which an individual can hold back, because under government bench, it is more likely that people who want to speak out and discuss their issues will be seen as less civil, they're seen as radical. And under opposition side, at least there is a recognition that desire for revenge lies in everybody. Therefore, at the point in which people are angry, at the point in which people try to revenge, that is seen as something that is justified and legitimate at the point in which we say that the desire for revenge is something that everybody shares to begin with. And I think that people are more likely to have worse mental health, therefore, under government side, at the point in which they're angry, given that opening government says that anger will be symmetric anyways, but you never have a channel to vent out. The best case of opening government is that you discuss some of these things with your friends or families. That never gets resolved at the point in which the perpetrator or the system that made you suffer to begin with never gets corrected or toppled down under their side of the bench. That means that people are likely to hold back, which leads to things like crippling emotion. You have repressed emotion at the point in which you cannot vent out, at the point in which you feel like the discussion does not lead to anything. At the point in which you are desired or you have a drive to revenge, that means that there's a clear pathway to vent out your anger, which is clearly good for the mental health of an individual. Secondly, I think that Haesung also told you that holding back and being patient is something that only privileged individuals can do. They are the ones who have the least amount of anger at the system. Therefore, oftentimes, if you're the most oppressed minorities, that is the point where harm actually maximizes. Thirdly, I think that people will not empathize at the point in which they do not have the lived experience, because opening government just asserts that people will just magically empathize with minorities under their side without actually giving us reason as to why that is true. I suggest the reason why empathy doesn't exist in the status quo, which probably symmetrically exists under government bench, is because of the fact that a lot of privileged people do not have that lived experience of suffering from things like poverty, suffering from things like racism. Therefore, I think that if privileged people are going to be unempathetic under both sides of the bench, we clearly give it a mechanism of how minorities are likely to speak out with having the agency and having the sense or desire to speak out through revenge. That is the mechanism that we provide for minorities. So I agree that the world will be more peaceful under government, but that peace is built upon perpetuating inequality that which we're unwilling to support in this debate. What is the mechanism of social change that was largely unresponded to by opening government? 6 things I'm going to address here. Firstly, strong sense of emotional and visceral factors will exist, which allows for people to unite right and solves the collective action problem that Haesung told you. Because when you have the idea that you want to revenge, it's not the changing social structure isn't just for the common good or social good. It now is something that is aligned with your own individual interest to be able to actualize and manifest that revenge, which means that I think people have an incentive to step out under our side of the bench. Secondly, because you have the revenge, that means that there's a clear target. Under government side, you might want to do something because you're unhappy, but there's no clear direction or guideline of what individuals ought to do. And therefore, I think that at the point in which you have a clear target that the movement is able to push for or hold to account, that gives individuals that sense of hope that we will be able to see this force topple down at one point. That gives individuals hope to be able to continually engage in social movement. Thirdly, I think that compensation and reparation at the point where privileged people realize that they might get fucked over as a result of revenge is something that is likely to happen, which Haesung already told you. Fourthly, I think that people have an incentive to end the cycle of violence at one point because people are rational. People have some level of desire to get out of conflict status. So I agree, maybe the privileged people might want to revenge on the minorities under our side of the bench, but I would suggest that that is fine because you cannot be in that perpetual cycle of revenge, which is why even when it comes to things like ethnic conflict, while it is true that there is some level of conflict that is going on, at one point there usually happens things like unity government that allows for the reconciliation to happen, which is why I think that the precondition for reconciliation is the process of fair anger, which does not exist under government bench. But fifthly, I suggest that opening government tries to say the state-sanctioned revenge is bad, but literally why? Because state has a principle to protect the vulnerables and restore justice. Opening government hinges their entire case on bad states that wrongly punish people, which I would suggest on the other hand that there are good states that correctly punish people like pedophiles. So it is unclear to me as to why in all instances state sanction and state prison system is always bad. I would suggest that it is actually fine that we have some level of state being able to impose orders and laws through legislation, which opening government seems to be fine ironically. I suggest that therefore, if the debate opening government wishes to address is in the context of bad states, we told you why citizens in the bad states have an incentive to hold their governments to account. That is that is where a tipping point lies in this debate. Lastly, I think that Haesung told you a very important material in terms of the preemptive measure of being nice and not being racist because of the chilling effect is extremely important. Because I say that the vast majority of individuals are nice and empathetic to an extent, which means that at the point where there's an acknowledgement that the desire of revenge is innate to every individual, people are less likely to be shitty because they don't want to get revenged. So therefore, as a result of the self-preservation incentive, people are less likely to crack down on other individuals. But under government side, even if you're a shit person, there is no repercussion, and therefore people feel less disincentive to be shitty and be racist under their side of the bench. So if people are scared, as what opening government says, that is good because that's what allows for people to not be as shit. So proud to oppose.
We prioritize vulnerable actors such as
Thanking the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that fine speech. Calling upon Member of Government to start the closing part, whenever you're ready.
Hi, am I audible?
Loud and clear.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Song Hyun, preferred pronouncer he and him, member of government. POIs in the chat, please. Yeah, and hi, Young and Haesung. I'm proud that Koreans are here. Yeah. My speech begins in 3, 2, 1. I just want to point out the contradiction coming from Youngwoo's speech, because on one hand, he says that this is a very important source of catharsis to the extent that people actually want to just express this anger so that they can actually feel this catharsis at the end of the day. But at the same time, he argues that the way people do this type of revenge is actually going to be lawful. It is not going to be as reckless as you expect. But I'm really unsure, because I think the most relevant stakeholders in today's debate are the ones who actually get the most damaged by the other people and therefore feel a massive amount of anger and therefore trying to find a way of catharsis at the end of the day. So for example, if Yo just makes fun of me, I might be pissed, but that doesn't really make me to revenge to a large extent, because that's just a minuscule thing that happens every day. So I really think that something that actually happens as an existential crisis is something that is a more relevant type of context that you have to deal with. And insofar as, for example, you are the victim of a sexual violence or when your child is killed, probably I'm really unsure as to why your revenge is actually going to be only bound to a law insofar as your anger is so much big and you actually want to have that catharsis whatsoever. But regardless, I'm going to firstly tell you as to why structural change under their set of the house is A, not exclusive, but secondly, even if you assume the exclusivity, I think the version of structural change is not necessarily going to be meaningful. A, I'm really unsure as to why their side is the only people who can actually deal with this type of things, because I think they also concede that anger is still going to exist under our side of the house, and people would have the symmetric desire to access catharsis at the end of the day, then probably people would actually be able to collectivize to actually make some type of social change and therefore feel catharsis. I'm really unsure as to why anger itself is not enough of a motivation, Eli, and why you actually need additional motive for revenge at the end of the day. But secondly, even if you don't buy this argumentation, I think there are so many multiple alternative ways that you can explore. For example, you actually have the desire for self-preservation. So for example, if you're a woman who actually want to promote a better career, but if you're blocked because of the glass ceiling, you actually have the incentive to demand for things like maternity leave or whatnot, or try to decrease the wage gap between men or women. Or if you're a gay person who actually want to get marriage rights, then probably you also have the incentive to demand for these things, even under our side of the house, precisely because of the self-preservation narrative. You also have things like logical rhetorics and principles. For example, feminism ideology that actually talks about as to why principally it is unfair for women to just be deprived of their rights at the end of the day. I'm really unsure as to why this particular motivation for motivation and desire for revenge is the only avenue for people to actually find sources of structural changes. But lastly, even if you assume that structural change only happens under their side of the house, why is it so good? Because I think under your side of the house, according to Haesung's analysis, you actually need a very strong desire for revenge in order to actually overcome all the fear of, for example, getting fired or whatnot. This means that this particular desire for revenge is big enough and impulsive enough for you to actually disregard all the risk that is entailed in the choice of taking part into structural changes and movements at the end of the day. So for example, under your side of the house, a lot of people, because of this impulse of revenge, probably they're going to recklessly join labor union, but at the end they just get fired and be unable to put food on the table. And I'm really unsure as to why this is a good thing, because just because you're born poor and you're staying poor doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be forced to actually join the social movement and to be slave of your impulse and make a reckless decision that actually causes irreversible harm. I think it's rather good that people actually make rational decisions and therefore try to at least keep some food on the table and therefore at least have some level of life sustainability. But the last thing, this is very important. Even in the best case scenario, I think the way you facilitate the movement is never going to be productive, because the focus of your movement is actually going to fucking a specific figure and going to be a specific target. And I think this is conceded by Jung when he said that we actually can target specific individuals. This happens for example, if you actually just fuck the dictator, then probably all the structural problem is gone. For example, if you just fuck the boss and CEO who tried to exploit me, then probably all the structural problem is gone. And I think it's very, very likely that people are going to think this way, because I think revenge comes from a specific experience and anecdotes and memories that people actually hold in their life. And that exactly is the reason that's why I'd be targeting a particular individual itself is a more likely scenario under their side of the house. The reason why this is very bad is because it actually leads to chilling effects after fucking that figure and leader. But the reason why this is insufficient is because it is the structure that actually enabled this particular individual to actually exploit you at the end of the day. That exactly is the reason I say, for example, in terms of banality of evil, just because just a normal government official was actually able to do a bad things like Holocaust, even though this person was not a really, really bad person at the end of the day. That exactly is the reason that's why tackling the structure itself is the most important thing under your side of the house, when people actually just fuck that particular individual who fucked you, and therefore you actually feel the catharsis, and therefore you do not really have additional motive to look at things like structural problems, then probably I think that is the moment when you stop there. And that's why I think it is bad. Under our side of the house, in the flip side, when you actually look at the structure without the impulse to revenge, and therefore be able to more rationally look at the problem in the structures, that is the moment when you can actually sort and try to seek for more structural changes at the end of the day. And I think this is much more better mechanism and much more charitable than opening government simply saying that all men are also going to be mad at the end. But the second thing I want to talk about is about the healing process versus depression, because there's a big deadlock in the opening half. OG simply argues that, people will be able to heal themselves and try to find self-development and improvement. Opening opposition view says that people cannot really deal with this anger and therefore they are going to be depressed. I think there's a deadlock because there actually is no likelihood analysis coming from either side of the house. I'm going to prove to you as to why this particular healing process is the more likely scenario and therefore win the opening opposition at the end of the day. This is because people, A, generally want to have happiness and catharsis, and therefore they do have the incentive to actively seek for the source of catharsis at the end of the day. But secondly, even if this is impossible also, I think it actually becomes a social problem to the extent that people are just so depressed and therefore people do not really find meanings in their lives and therefore commit a lot of suicide or whatnot. I think insofar as people actually feel that I actually need to restore my meaning of life and therefore make this particular issue of like dealing with things like depression becomes a very important political issue as well. I mean, this also leads to people actually voting upon these issues. And for example, politicians also have the incentive to care about these people at the end of the day. What this means is that I think media who actually want to actually tap into the like people's desire to seek for things like catharsis are actually going to look for actually ways to and try to give up stories of like people actually being able to overcome certain type of traumas and try to heal themselves, and therefore people can actually access catharsis at the end of the day, and therefore people can also look at those type of media narratives and actually feel that I also have the avenue to actually make myself better. But the second thing is that I think because politicians also care about these type of issues, I think the social structure and the system is actually going to make sure that these people can, for example, access things like counseling and better like give better ability for people to actually make the second chance of their life at the end of the day. This engages into the idea of opening opposition that this is very inaccessible to vast majority of individuals. And so far as we able to enable these individuals to actually access these type of things, then probably I think we also flip the argument coming from the opening opposition, co-opt all their benefits. For all these reasons, I'm very, very proud to propose.
Thanking the member of government for that fine speech. Member of Off, whenever you're ready.
Hello, am I perfectly audible and visible?
Yep.
Great. I'd love to take a POI, presumably from opening government around 5:30ish. If I don't take it, Anshuman will take you. Sorry, Anshuman. Give me 5 seconds and I'll start. Okay, starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, start. Panel, this is a plain and simple attribution debate. In other words, in this debate, what closing opposition will tell you is that the harms that exist or were perpetrated because of revenge would exist regardless of whether revenge as an emotion existed or not. However, the benefits that arose because of revenge as an emotion retrospectively, because note this debate has to happen retrospectively, only could uniquely happen because of revenge. What's the context? And this is where I flag my case and then go into extensive argumentation. Note the context to this is power versus powerless. Powerful people versus powerless people. We'll argue to you that emotions like anger, hatred, or a flawed sense of justice for that matter are uniquely accessible to the powerful, and therefore they would keep on doing things which they did because of revenge, perhaps in a slower way and therefore perhaps in a more meticulous way, which is worse, by the way. But two, the powerless would not be able to do any of that. We'll explain it to you why, right? But before that, a lot of characterization which has been lacking in this debate. I asked Tarushi this question right in the first speech. I think they should have taken the chance, seized this chance and clarified this to you, but they don't. Let's look at what revenge looks like vis-a-vis other emotions, because I think there are some blurry lines here, right? Because we don't think they're squirreling the debate if they say there are same reactions which can be reached without revenge, because that's literally within the scope of the debate. Let's understand what revenge looks like. Revenge is an emotion that rises in your gut. It's emotive in nature and therefore it's free of thought. Therefore, it is something which comes in your gut and captures you, and it is disproportionate. Sure, agreeably, it overwhelms you. It makes you act in a certain way, even when you don't want to act in that particular way. It's reactionary, it's primitive. It's important to note that it is anger, but with direction, and anger, but with attribution. Revenge is that feeling which, when you feel wrong and you know who wronged you, and you want to know how to channel it. Revenge is anger with direction. Note what is the comparative then. The comparative then is three emotions, right? A flawed sense of justice or any sense of justice, which means that even without revenge, you still want to, like, criminal justice system still presumably exists because you still want to balance the barter. You still want to balance the deeds, because this is simply like, this is literally what Old Testament is built on. Like entire Kantian categorical imperative is built on, because human beings have a moral instinct within them, which means that a flawed sense of justice would still exist. But second, anger would exist. I'll explain anger to you in a while. Anger is that bad feeling that arises in you when you're wrong, right? But it doesn't have a direction. Revenge gives it a direction. I'll tell you why that is important. But three, it's about hatred. Here is where the comparative is. Let's look at the harms versus the benefits, right? Why would the harms exist regardless? Look, we posit that actors like Hitler, like who literally like labeled Jews as November criminals, or actors like genocidal regimes within Nigeria, Tutsis and Hutsis, so on and so forth, would exist regardless. Because hey, look, first of all, they have a flawed sense of justice. Insofar as these people, actors are likely to be megalomaniacs, which means these actors are likely to be egotistical and are likely to control power in a selfish and greedy way. They will be able to determine what justice is really for them in a long term. Which means Hitler, when he was writing My Kampf, he literally wrote that I believe that I need to just like make everything good for the world, which means he did it because he thought that he was acting out of a benevolence. He did it because he thought that he was presumably, perhaps making sure that only the best of the genes survived, which means these sources of action exist regardless of whether you remove revenge. The only differential then is we agree that revenge overpowers you, it's disproportionate, it takes you over, it's reactionary, it's primitive. But even on the comparative, when you have a flawed sense of justice and you are able to perpetuate that sense of justice because you are in the majority, you have certain power that comes with your word, you have certain number of people who have similar like incentive structures as you, which means that you are able to perpetrate everything that you were able to do in name of revenge yesterday, which means everything which gov side like harms on gov side exists regardless, which means you do it even without like even when there is no emotions like revenge because you have a flawed sense of justice. Where is the comparative in this debate though? And this is where we are uniquely better. Like even the part before this was uniquely better. Okay, fine. I'll tell you why we are much better there. Look, in terms of benefits, and this is interesting. When you don't give direction to anger, it translates into self-blame for minorities. Note that into your sheets, and I'll tell you what that really means, and specifically in the context of power asymmetry and why is that a harm. Notice majority actors control the media, they control the narrative, they control popular culture, they control everything that makes your brain. Because your brain is a tabula rasa, you're born without morals and ethics. The society paints them and ingrains them. Two, there is certain power that comes, like power that is attached to certain words, which instance, like, for instance, like the words of the church or religious structures who are controlled by the majority branches. Which means note that when anger as an emotion is born, it is born without direction. Trigger warning. For instance, sexual assault victims oftentimes end up blaming themselves for what happened with them. This happens with all kinds of victims at every day and every point. The reason why that happens is because that when revenge, which is a tsunami that rises within you and tells you what to do, isn't there in you, you look out to the society, you look out to where really should you direct your anger, because anger lacks direction inherently. Even a sense of justice, and if this is about sense of justice, right? If minorities like sense of justice is again coordinated and controlled by powerful like people who control semantics and philosophy. Because look, what is revenge and philosophy? Like what is philosophy justice about? It's rooted deeply in philosophy. It's rooted deeply in popular culture, which again is controlled by majority. Look what the comparative then really is. If you're a minority and you think something wrong which happened with you, I think it becomes incredibly easy for the society to self-blame you, tell you things like, look, the reason why this is happening to you is because your karmic balance is screwed, bro. The reason this is happening to you is because in the past birth, you literally acted in a bad way. You killed somebody, and that's why you were born a Shudra in an Indian context. In other contexts, it means like if you're a black of African American, that's presumably because you are the like progeny of Can, and that's because you did something bad in the past. This is how religious structures exist. This is how self-blame is perpetuated. I'll take opening government if I have anything. 5 seconds I have left. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Shoot.
If both of words are exactly the same, with the exact same responsibility.
I'm sorry, like your audio wasn't clear, but from what I understood, you are asking that, oh, the same incentive structure exists. No bullshit. I explained it to you that when you are simply angry and not revengeful, your anger doesn't have direction. You look to the society to give it a direction, because that's literally what revenge is, right? And we are the only one who gives you a definition for that. Revenge is anger with direction. Revenge is anger with attribution. When there is only anger, which is a feeling of uneasiness within you, you look out to understand your own emotions, because people don't understand themselves, right? That's simple psychological analysis. I don't know if I love somebody. It's too tough to really look into a mirror and look at your emotions, which is where you start relying on society, which is where I have a threefold structural analysis in terms of popular culture, media, religion, and third, the way in which philosophy and semantics are rooted, which means it's so much easier to gaslight minorities and tell them, look, perhaps the only person you should be angry with is you yourself, because blame yourself, because you are the one who did these mistakes. You are the November criminals. You did something with this country which was horrible. The way in which this narrative plays, I can elucidate that through multiple examples, but I think I've done enough in terms of principle to give you a self-autonomous principle to prove to you that, look, any and every harm that arose because of revenge would exist regardless, because the powerful will still have a flawed sense of justice. The powerful will still have the power to get angry in the direction in which they choose, because they control the media. The poor, the powerless won't. For all those reasons, vote for closing opposition. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Thanking the member of opposition for that fine speech. Cup, whip, and away ready.
Oh, can I be seen and heard?
Yep.
Okay.
아, 그게 싼 거야?
원래
나
풀 The OG case is simple. They first say that there's a cycle of violence, and then they move on to say that people will heal on their own. Firstly, I think the OO says that there are already laws, and I feel as though the OG also concedes it when they run an argument about the criminal justice system. So I feel as though it is correct for the OO to point out that the OG's argument is quite extreme at worst. The second thing is, they don't give us any mechanism as to explain why people will not be gobbling up their emotions, because that's the main challenge coming from the OO. These are the two things that the CG is filling up. Firstly, we explained to you a way individuals can better access catharsis on our side. The second thing is why we get better change in general. First, dealing with the OO. The OO comes up and says, well, you will not be able to voice out because on their side, you can only on their side, you can pull resources from the sort. This is untrue because oftentimes the premise of often movements aren't revenge. It is a desire to live a better life. So if I'm in the LGBT community and the government doesn't allow me to get gay marriage, obviously I would still want to fight for gay marriage because it improves my life. So it doesn't have to be a revenge for people to opt into movement. But second, Sungin also gives you the worst case analysis, saying that even if it is true that some people opt out of movements, that is probably good for individuals because we think that movements don't own individuals to be owned as battering rams. This means that if the framing from Haesung is that these problems are too big to be solved, then presumably if you lash out at a problem that you cannot realistically solve and you get lynched as a result of that, this is probably actively harmful for individuals as well. Telling people that it is on you to fix the problems, well, is I think morally reprehensible in the first place. But second, problem. They don't explain why slightly more aggressive approach that they want to push will get them actual change on their side, because they say this will get them more attention, but they don't really connect this to things like change in the first place, because they themselves, so Youngwoo says that there is no empathy on both sides. So in this case, he cannot also come up and say, oh, but then there's also empathy that will solve if people start fighting for it. So they also rebut themselves in the same process. But second, I would say even if empathy is something that exists, it is something that is probably limited, right? So insofar as Sungyeon tells you that oftentimes, like, insofar as Youngwoo tells you that rich people don't have lived experiences, I'm not sure as to why rich people have the same lived experiences under their side of the house, and then rich people will suddenly feel very empathetic to poor people in the first place. So I think the metric to social change was something that is just very vague coming from the OO in the first place. So that's not an impact you can give them the debate for. Second, we told you that the counterfactual is oftentimes in the opposition world, you have the media showing people and telling people that the only way for you to get catharsis is if you complete the revenge. We said that people, obviously victims, people feeling a sense of victimhood and anger probably still exist on our side. And so what the media does oftentimes is because you want to still cater to them, they change the narrative. And when you say, well, look, it shows people, for example, of people moving on. It shows you are fighting your own demons and telling you that it is not your fault, that you can still move on and live a better life on. And you recovering from that process is what gives you catharsis. That is a sort of narrative that the media is likely to perpetuate, insofar as there's still a large number of victims on our side, and the media still wants to make sure they cater to the majority of people, which is why we think the alternative sources of or catharsis is likely to be something that exists in our world. Why do we think this is significantly better? Because note that things like revenge is only accessible if you complete the revenge. And this is oftentimes not possible under Youngwoo's own characterization, because Youngwoo says that the structure is against the minorities. And I'm not really clear as to why for example, criminal justice system is likely to be favoring minorities in that first place. So insofar as you have a desire to get revenge, but then the criminal justice system is from the perspective of the perpetrators and the rich people, I'm not sure as to why you will get that revenge in the first place. So on up, what you get is you feel a strong feeling of revenge, but you're not able to complete it, which is why you have a continuous feeling of not having your catharsis felt. We would say that on the flip side, things like self-preservation is the most accessible narrative, since you're the one that decides when you have recovered and when you are ready to move on, when you have actively like been healed from that process. So it is not based on external factors. It is something that you get to decide on your own. And that is the point at which it becomes more accessible to individuals in the first place. But second, I would say comparatively, things like self-recovery and self-preservation is something that is not accessible, because Hezong tells you that revenge uniquely makes you super, super irrational to the point in which you don't care about your own self-preservation, and then you go out and do their movements. So I think Hezong's analysis actually completes our own analysis that self-preservation is something you cannot achieve, because Hezong says if you don't preserve self-preservation, then you go out and do movements. So they have already given up self-preservation. That is something we can only access in the absence of a strong emotion, such as revenge. Lastly, I would say even if revenge was an accessible form of something people can access, I would say this is inherently something that is bad. Because oftentimes in the process of getting revenge, you have to define your life, not based on what you like, your own preferences, but based on how well you have actively caused harm to the other person who have done wrong against you. So for example, if Sally slaps me, my life is now defined based on how well I can slap her back, for example, as opposed to me doing the things I want to heal myself and the sort. This means that you will constantly remind yourself of your anger, and your mission, your central mission becomes actively causing harm, as opposed to internally thinking about why I'm angry, for example, what has been done to me, and how I can become a better person, how I can heal from this process moving on. But lastly, let's say social change to a certain extent is possible on both sides. Note that you have to assume that social change is possible on both sides equally if you claim that social change is possible, because the mechanisms for social change on both sides is both empathy. We think in a world in which social change is still possible, we get that better. The reason for this is because you get a more rational identification of the problem, because Hezong says that the mechanism for their side is irrational anger. This means that they themselves claim this is likely to be directed at individuals as opposed to looking at structures. This means, for example, sexual abuse victims are likely to try and fuck over one person who did it, as opposed to the media, for example, focusing on a single target, as opposed to you trying to look at individual problems and trying to expose the problem that exists in structure. I think in a world in which you're able to more rationalize these things and look at the problem is the world in which you're able to point out what the issues of the structure is and actively solve it, which is the point at which you get better social change. So on their side, I would say, sure, maybe you might fight because you have a directed anger, but that anger is directed not at a structure, but it is directed as just one person. So at the point at which you're able to punish that one person is the moment at which you stop fighting, because it is no longer your point to do revenge. This is really important analysis, because one, it is a better mechanism from the OG when it comes to dealing with the O's case. Second, the solvency is O's own metric, therefore we deal with it. But lastly, CEO says, well, this is anger with direction. Look, yeah, direction exists, but then our analysis just now proves that this direction is something that is actively harmful. But the last thing you say is, sure, I would say that in a world in which you don't have a clear direction that is given to you in the form of a perpetrator, is there a world in which you introspect more and you try to look at why I am angry, right? Because people will still be angry. They'll now think of why they're angry. And that is the world in which they're able to better identify issues that exist in their life and issues in the structure and get a better identification of the problem we're so proud to propose.
Thanking the government for that fine speech, calling upon opposition rep to wrap up the debate.
Hello, can somebody confirm I'm clear, audible, visible?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'll be starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Site closing government says that at the point when you don't have a clear perpetrator, you are likely to look into yourself and find out why you are angry, and you are likely to be rational. What is rationality a result of? You become rational on the basis of what you have learned, what you know, and everything that you have understood. As a minority, for a very long time, you have understood that you are suffering harms because of your own wrong deeds. You did something in your last birth life, and that's why you are born in a poor family. Your ancestor did something, and that's why you're suffering this fate. At the point when you have the ability to rationalize something simply because of the 3 structural reasons that Siddharth gave to you, that is religious and cultural beliefs, philosophical beliefs, and the false sense of justice, that is the narrative creation ability that the majority has to say that you did this and that's why you have to suffer. You deserve the suffering that you have. That becomes the rationality in your mind. If that is the rational belief that you have in your mind, And when you don't have a direction to somehow throw your anger at somebody else, you would resort to that rationality and you would blame yourself. Let me weigh this debate through and through with a very clear example, and you will understand how this messy debate can be solved in a minute. You are an individual who has suffered years of racism and slavery. Side opening government says that the way to go forward is forgiveness. Given you don't have the ability to desire for action now, you are much more likely to understand why they did it, and therefore you are likely to forgive. The issue is this argument doesn't apply to most individuals who are suffering at this point because they cannot forgive. Why? Because the suffering is continuous in nature. It's not true that the suffering happened yesterday and would not happen tomorrow, which means the continuous nature of suffering doesn't let you forgive. Therefore, OG counterfactual isn't true. Opening opposition argues that without the sense of revenge, you would never be able to go against the perpetrator. Closing government says that is not true. There always exists a sense of justice. That is, you try to gain justice against somebody who harmed you. So even without the feeling of revenge, you try to gain justice in a rational manner. That is, according to closing government, in their world, they believe even with a sense of justice, you can surely gain some level of independence or some level of agency. We explicitly tell you justice you gain only when you are able to identify who the perpetrator is. You can gain it only when you clearly know who harmed you. The society constantly tells you that you are in a bad position because of your own action. What does that mean? Without the sense of direction to replicate your anger, you are always going to blame yourself for all the things that you have done because you are constantly told to do so. Opening government POI is correct. That is going to happen in both worlds. That is, religious structures exist in both worlds. In both worlds, people do believe to a certain extent that they are responsible for the things that have happened to them. People are retrospective, they hold themselves accountable. Why is the sense of revenge so important? Sense of revenge is irrational. It doesn't let you think. It doesn't let you fall into the religious perception that you have been a part of. Somebody harmed you, you hate them, and you want to harm them as well, which means you no longer ascribe the harm to yourself. You no longer think you yourself are causing it because you have become irrational. Right now, you believe that somebody else did this to you and you want to take them out of power, which means only when you stop blaming yourself, you blame yourself most of the times, but only when you are so angry that you want to harm them, only when you are so angry that you want to take revenge, you ascribe the blame on somebody else, and only then you have any ability to get out of the oppressive cycle, because only then you are likely to ascribe harm to the actual perpetrator. That is, sense of justice, sense of rationality, sense of forgiveness, none of this gives you the actual perpetrator to the harms that have been caused to you. Only when you have a sense of revenge, you are irrational, because rationality perpetuates self-blame. Only when you have a sense of revenge, you become totally irrational and you want to harm somebody who harmed you, and therefore you find out who the perpetrator is, and only then you can get out of this cycle of oppression. I will take one from closing government. Closing off. Closing off. I saw a POI written. Closing off, opening off, quickly, be quick. No POIs? Can anyone hear me? Okay, I'll just continue even if you can't hear me, okay? Somebody just write it in the chat because I'm very confused. More often than not, the world that we live in constantly tells us that there is no other way to go. But there are still mechanisms which would punish people who do wrong things. For instance, side opening government's last argument that is standing in the debate is that criminal justice system would necessarily become more rehabilitative. You would give less punishment and you would somehow be much more happier or much more accommodating towards the criminals. They say that state most often than not over punishes people, But state doesn't over-punish people on the basis of things such as revenge. They over-punish people on the basis of politics, racism, that would still exist. The second thing is, they did not argue that rehabilitation is a good thing. Rehabilitation means lesser punishment, which means very hard criminals can get out early and harm the society again, which means less deterrence. Unless they prove rehabilitation in and of itself is a good thing, their argument doesn't stand. Let me weigh very clearly. Does side opening opposition argue that this is a good enough mechanism to find justice? Yes, but they are taken down by CG, because CG tells you that at the point when you stop being revengeful and when you start being rational, you can identify a perpetrator. But also with a sense of justice, you can find something like getting out of oppression. We uniquely tell you that you can't do that simply because you ascribe responsibility on yourself. That's how we are different than O. I hope that was clear enough. Very proud to win this debate.
Thank you, Akif, and thank you to all speakers for a wonderful debate. I think the panelists will deliver on Discord, and the results will be announced during the closing ceremony. Once again, congratulations everyone for making it this far.
Thank you for the debate. Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining in. The results will be, as Yasho said, will be declared in the closing ceremony. Join there as well. Thank you so much for joining.